Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of In Conversation with CCW Europe. I'm Simon Hall, your host and industry analyst at CCW Europe, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Bethan Lynch, Head of Customer Experience at B&Q. Bethan, welcome.
Lovely to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. And just to kick off the conversation, I wondered if I could first ask you to just run us through your professional background and talk us through how you got to where you are now.
Great. So I've worked in retail and in customer experience roles for about the last 10 years. Started out in strategy consulting before that, but over the last 10 years, I've worked with some really big UK brands, so Waitrose, John Lewis, and most recently with Kingfisher and specifically B&Q. And across that time, I've done a range of customer-facing roles, so designed shops, designed apps, set marketing strategies, and really kind of looked at all parts of that end-to-end customer experience.
Wonderful. And so the core theme of what we're going to talk about today is the synergies that exist between mobile apps and brand loyalty. But if we take apps out of that equation just for a moment, I'd love to get your take on how you've seen the landscape of loyalty evolve more broadly over the last few years. You know, how has it changed and why should loyalty be top of mind for business leaders today?
Well, I think ultimately we all know those kind of industry stats that say our consumers have never been as disloyal as they are now.
For sure.
And they are shopping across a huge range of brands, and therefore kind of loyalty and that drive for loyalty becomes so much more important. It costs businesses so much money to acquire customers,
Yeah.
and therefore getting a great retention strategy makes perfect business logic. In terms of the trends in the last, probably like if you really think about the last 18 months, I feel like we had companies with loyalty schemes and one without, and now it's kind of a bit renowned in terms of everyone playing in that field in some shape or form.
Yeah.
Moving away from kind of points-based systems, but more about how do I connect with the customer group that my brand is relevant to, and how do I offer them rewards that are valuable to them.
Wonderful. And we'll touch on trends further in the conversation. But for those who are looking to build an app to kickstart their loyalty program and or augment their omni-channel strategies, what are some of the best practices that they should be keeping in mind as they work to get it off the ground?
So I think the key principle to start with is you've got to decide on the vision for your app. What is it there to do for your customers? And how is it going to maybe go beyond that core commerce journey that it is necessary for it to offer, but probably doesn't give it kind of that long-term value for the customer. So I think in any business starting out in the app space, making sure you really spend some time understanding what that end state could look like and what the vision for that product and the role that product is going to play in your customers' lives is absolutely critical. And I think you need to then combine that with a setup in your organization about how you're going to build and run this product. So how are you going to make sure this is a holistic effort in terms of an engineering, a product focused design, but also moving into how you're going to trade it and how you're going to market it to your customers. So I think to be successful in the app space, you really have to have those two core components: end vision for your customers and a team that's ready to deliver that.
Well, that tees up my next question perfectly, in that I think a lot of companies fall into the trap of creating an app that almost mirrors their own website, right? And they waste an opportunity to really enrich and enhance, the mobile experience for their customers. So with that in mind, what do you think are some of the core features or attributes or components that make for a successful app ecosystem?
So I think when you think about apps, as you've just touched on, they're not a website. They do function in different ways. The devices have different functionalities. And you really have to decide on that native strategy that you're going to go after. Really making the most of the capabilities that sit on someone's phone. So whether that be the camera, whether that be notifications, whether that be the fact that it carries in your pocket when you're at home or when you're going into a physical interaction with that brand too. You've got to find the moments that are going to make the difference. So I think when you're setting out on that journey, you do have to have a really good commerce journey fundamentally. Like you do have to have a journey. The primary reason a customer downloads an app is for ease. You have to deliver on that metric. Otherwise, it's a download and delete and never use again. So you have to have an easy journey to complete whatever your core aspect of your business is. And then you really do need to combine that with whatever your loyalty mechanics are. Because otherwise, you really don't want in your marketing strategy a competing download the app, sign up for my loyalty scheme kind of
Sure.
competition going on. You need to
should be
bring those two to be
together.
one and the same thing. Once you've achieved those two things, then really looking across your customer journey and looking for moments that really resonate with when someone's holding a device in their hand. Collections experiences are a great example of this. And if you look at Target in the US, they've pushed themselves up to 70% of digital transactions going through on their app.
Wow.
And that's absolutely to do with a combination of rewards being surfaced on their app and a really smooth, efficient collection system.
That's great. And what about the data piece of all this?
I mean, ultimately, so if you think about that customer expectations piece, we've talked about ease, but then also you're sitting on their personal device. And
Yeah.
as we're going forward, that expectation around personalization is going to continue to increase. And the apps that customers use the most are likely to be the ones that are most relevant, relevant to them. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think there is a lot of apps offering like a great detailed personal experience end to end, but it definitely feels like the next space we're going to go. And you have that real dynamic between what is possible to do in an apps environment, particularly if you're using on-device data versus kind of things that are going into your broader company ecosystem.
And in many industries, just the lure of being able to collect so much first party data is often, reason to invest in itself, right? But how can you ensure that you're collecting, managing, curating all of that? How can you ensure that you're doing that effectively and safely in the app environment?
So I think that's definitely one of the biggest challenges to app development at the moment, like in the context of third party versus first party data.
Sure.
Like apps are a fantastic environment to be collecting that information.
100%.
I think you've got to start with having really understood how your app is linking back into your broader company's data infrastructure. And really, you can get into some serious complexities in terms of if you're sending individual pieces of data to multiple locations.
Yeah.
Actually, you can put a lot of weight and effort into your app processing if you're not careful. So really making sure you step back and have understood what types of data I'm likely to want to share and how that's going to fit into the wider company ecosystem is critical. And then I think making some focused decisions about really linking back to that original vision about where you want to go. What information is it that is likely to help you be able to deliver that vision? So therefore, how can we use the app environment to collect some of that information from our customers? And I think when we were working in the John Lewis space, actually using that environment to collect information about children and in the nursery kind of mission and understanding kind of who the customer was and who they were purchasing for really can then allow you to enhance the experience you can offer your customers.
And you touched upon personalization a moment ago. I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into that because it's just so important today, right? When it comes to driving highly engaged consumers to your products, and it's a real driver of like that deeper brand loyalty. So how can brands start to humanize their in-app environment?
Yeah, and I think that you actually touched on John Lewis then, where I was kind of leading the app team whilst I was there, and we had a real challenge in this space because actually, if you look at the breadth of the John Lewis customer, but then you kind of pull that down to the core customer, actually, it's really easy to kind of alienate if you're not careful. So
Sure.
in that example, if you were a kind of probably a woman between kind of 30 to 50. It's like a relatively broad span. But if you're effectively purchasing into fashion and beauty with John Lewis, then actually the app entry would have felt really, really relevant to you. If you were a person purchasing in technology, which we tended to skew towards more a male audience at that point, actually our experience and entry point could feel really alienating. So really looking to kind of introduce versions of that welcome experience that they feel relevant to the categories that you're buying with the brand is a really good start to kind of a personalization journey. I think the challenge to that is a lot of those are very content rich parts of your experience. And so actually is your business set up to be able to provide you with the content to be able to feel more relevant to those audiences was our biggest challenge rather than the actual technical capability of being able to personalize a page.
Sure. Well, perfect segue onto my next question. We've touched upon data and we've touched upon personalization. There were two areas that, if done poorly, could potentially hinder the success of an app, right? So, are there any other challenges or roadblocks that brands should be keeping in mind as they start to
I think
navigate
personalization and data are two great ones. I think you also touched on another one earlier, which is like just embedding your web experience.
Yeah.
Not taking a app specific approach to your development really will hinder you. It will give you a lower performing product, both from an actual kind of performance aspect, but also from the experience that you're offering the customer, because actually customers are really ingrained in some native behaviors on their apps and appreciating the difference between Android and iOS. Actually, Android users, if you listen to any feedback from them, the worst thing you can do is replicate a complete iOS interface and then try and implant it into that environment. Because there are some subtle differences to making sure you really stretch your UX research capability to build those experiences is, I think, another potential pitfall.
And what comes next then for the app market? How can brands elevate them from moving just beyond the digital shopping environment to a tool that can deliver real valuable, meaningful business growth?
Yeah, so I think what it's important to say is that in most examples, businesses are clearly, or definitely in the two examples I've worked in, businesses are clearly demonstrating the values of app already. So
Yeah.
in both organizations I've been in, we've been able to prove that incremental value of an app user based on understanding cohort analysis between customers that were similar before but haven't downloaded the app, and ones that are the same, but the only difference is they've downloaded the app. And year one value in both businesses has been high and justifies the investment in the app. So I think what we can say already is that apps is a smart choice for businesses, but it's becoming a more and more congested space. You are really competing for real estate on the homepage of someone's phone.
Yeah.
So therefore, how are you going to differentiate in the future comes back to exactly where we started, which is that vision piece.
Yeah.
So I still think most businesses are operating in a core shopping journey, get loyalty right within this infrastructure. Whereas actually, how do we stretch into having bigger roles for our customers? I think if we looked in a John Lewis context, how do we explore kind of personal shopping, recommendations, curations in a much more extensive way? How do they transition that service that they're known for in store into a digital environment is a key aspect of how they could look at that in the future. Or when we're in a B&Q space, what does that mean for project planning or managing my house in the future? Those are really interesting trends that we're starting to explore to say, how do we have a bigger role in customers' lives? I think a business that did this really interestingly is, I haven't heard of it, it's called like a Yoto player. It's a kids kind of plays books, like audiobook player. But actually they reversed it and they didn't take their commerce journey as the first role for their app. So their app ultimately allows you, these cards that you have at home that you've purchased and you've spent money on that play on this player, allows you then to play all that audio to your children in the car. But they've extended that. They've added podcasts for children, curated podcasts for children, created radio stations for children. Very cool. So it really, they knew their target market. They've offered a product that has a meaningful role in customers' lives, and we're probably kind of 3-4 years in to that product existing, and only now are they starting to think about how their commerce journey integrates into that environment. But what they will have is a base of customers that are totally ingrained in using that product. And I think that's a great example of how you can kind of ensure that you're never going to be deleted from someone's phone, which is ultimately the objective of what you're trying to achieve, right? Deletion rate is something that you should be keeping a very, very close track on.
Well, speaking of objectives, how can you measure the success of these apps? What kind of KPIs should you be looking at?
And I think it really depends on where you are in the evolution of your product. So I think having a clear idea of what audience size you want to get to, because at the beginning, I think really focusing on stuff that drives download and engagement, ultimately using the app, is really, really critical. And focusing on those things at the top end of that funnel is really important. As you become more mature, and we were probably more in that space in John Lewis, then you start to focus on things that are going to drive conversion. And we were typically experiencing a higher conversion within that app space, a much more engaged audience. And then you are also tracking that life cycle of the customer. So can you really at any one time describe where your user base is? How many people are recent downloads versus adopters versus embedded? And really see people through that cycle is where you'll get value from the product.
Interesting. And what about the technology piece? What kind of technology should form the foundation of a successful app?
So how at the base of it, in terms of architecture, it's definitely like evolving at the moment. So I suppose over the kind of last 10 years, we've gone from ultimately just using web development to surface things within the native environment to a very focused kind of iOS, Android development path. And where we're now exploring in B&Q is actually using a KMM platform, which will enable us to build quite heavily for both devices before we have to do the final element of differentiation. So having as much crossover as possible. That's like your base foundation and your platform. I think then what becomes much more fascinating, and where I expect technology is going to go in the next 2 years is the capability of a camera. That's like hugely evolved in the, you know, with Pro on Apple, like the home measurement you can do within that device. There are so many more capabilities that customers' phones are going to have. That is really where I think the kind of technical innovation will focus in the next few years.
Well, that tees up my last question perfectly, and it's a two-pronged question. You just touched upon it there, but there's so much to get excited about in our industry, isn't there? But what's the one key trend that you see coming to the fore over the next 12 months in both the app space and in customer experience more generally?
I mean, it's quite hard to not talk about AI at the moment, isn't it? And I like hate to be the one that is, brings us back to that, because I'm sure every conversation you have brings that up in some way. But I do feel like there is still most companies are not offering really an outlet for customer experience or customer service within their apps infrastructure. And I think there's so many tests going on.
Yes.
It's such an interesting technology that it's the buzzword. Everyone
100%.
wants to get involved.
Yep.
And therefore, there are so many tests in the market that I feel like there will be success stories that come out from
Soon,
that,
sure.
both across web into app, in terms of how we're really transitioning great service into a digital environment, which has always been a challenge, but is truly like a great opportunity for brands to differentiate against some of the more mass market players that are playing in multiple markets.
Anything outside of AI?
So I think if we come back to the apps environment specifically, I think how brands are developing their physical environment, the role for the app in the physical environment. So we've seen a lot of trends of in-store modes, how I navigate around a shop. You're definitely seeing the kind of travel and retail and leisure industries really exploit that app for when I'm in an experience. And I think there's a lot more to go in that space in terms of how apps can support you whilst you're interacting with a brand in a physical space, to really deliver great customer service and make that journey end to end as seamless as possible.
Bethan, thank you so much. Great insights. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So that brings to a close this episode of In Conversation with CCW Europe. But please do stick around on the CCW Europe website and social media channels, where you can find so much great content related to anything and everything in the worlds of customer experience and customer management. Thank you once again to Bethan for joining me. Thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, goodbye.